Welcome to the Institute of Advanced Studies and to a Loughborough conversation. I'm Professor Marsha Meskimmon and I'm in the School of the Arts, English and Drama. And it's my really great pleasure to be having this conversation with Professor Nikos Papastergiadis, who is joining us from the University of Melbourne, where he is the director of the Research Institute in Public Cultures. And he is also, of course, a real expert in questions around migration, art, public culture, diaspora, and a whole range of issues that make him a really wonderful keynote, and he's been a very brilliant visitor for us in the Art and Migration strand this semester, which is part of the migration strand that's been hosted and convened by Darren Smith, and we want to thank him as well for inviting and hosting these sessions for us. Nikos's work ranges from a whole range of really pivotal publications in the field, including The Turbulence of Migration, Dialogues in the Diaspora, Cosmopolitanism and Culture, and recent work on ambient screens and the notion of reconstituting the commons through screen culture, the big screens that we all exist with now in visual culture, but also a really important set of links in terms of biennials, triennials that he's worked with. He was part of Documenta 13, which for the area of thinking differently about how one constitutes public culture through institutions and cultural forms was a really pivotal exhibition. And in this country, for a period when he was at the University of Manchester, he was involved in two really important things that occurred. One is a journal, which was known as Third Text, and is still going, slightly differently convened, but was a very, very critical, key publication in the field. And the other is the establishment of INNOVA, which is the Institute of International Visual Arts. Again, still going, still really important, transformed in some ways over the period, but really significant cultural institutions. So with that said, I'm extremely happy to begin a conversation, and we really want to have a chance to hear some of Nikos's thoughts on questions around art and migration. And he has come to us for the week. He has given us wonderful time and a lot of time and energy on some of our events. And his keynote was centered on a particular project that he's working on right now. And that's what I'd like to first turn to Nikos and talk about, really, which is the project on l'Internazionale. And I thought maybe you could tell us a bit about it, open it up, and talk about key insights that it's driven for you.
Well, first, thank you very much. That was a very splendid and warm and kind invitation and generous introduction. And I have to also acknowledge the significant role you've played in my own personal intellectual journey. In a sense, I've looked at you, especially in the last dozen years, as someone who's always on my shoulder, pushing, nudging me along, making me rethink and articulate and clarify some of my own thoughts. So it's been a joy and a stimulus to be in your company. And but to get to your question about l'Internazionale, this is it does, in a sense, refer back to that arc of engagement with art and institutions that started for me when I was a PhD student. And one of the first jobs I had to do, as my first catalogue essay ever, was for Kettle's Yard Gallery in Cambridge for an exhibition called Rewriting History. And the assistant to that, curatorial assistant, was a young Charles Esch. So it was my first gig, and one of his first gigs was to edit my first piece of writing. And since then we've been, close friends and worked together on many different projects. And he's now the director of an Abi Museum in Eindhoven, which is one of the 6 partners in this thing called l'Internazionale. L'Internazionale is a confederation of 6 museums which have come together to work on collaborative and transnational projects to do what they need to do together, what they can't do alone. To work according to the principles of unity and diversity, to outflank perhaps the problems of globalization and neoliberalism, to sort of overcome some of the limitations and the parochialism of civic nationalism, to rethink some of the foundations of the autonomous artist versus the publicly and socially engaged and the transnationally connected artist, to open up questions about publics and whether they are seen as passive recipients of ideas or active contributors and shapers of narratives, to extend the ways in which and reconstitute and reconfigure the narratives by which art is told, etc., etc. So 6 museums: MACBA in Barcelona, Reina Sofia in Madrid, Moderna Gallery in Ljubljana, Mucha in Antwerp, Van Abbe, I just mentioned, in Eindhoven, Holland, and of course SALT in Istanbul, Turkey. The directors of these museums have worked together for many years and part of a common intellectual and critical discourse that I think you could frame in terms of the post-colonial term that third text was instrumental in developing. Also the feminist thinking, that, which was part of the institutional critique, was also instrumental in their thinking. And more recently, the discursive and socially engaged streams in contemporary art practice. So they're the constitutive and influential themes and streams of intellectual and creative practice that have informed this, intellectually, this field. But in a sense, the idea of l'internationale comes from the challenges of working in a globalizing world that isn't simply trying to perform like another economic agent, in other words, developing more franchises, nor is it trying to sort of simply saying everything you do has to be done in a local way. So it has this complex reconfiguration of a cosmopolitan vision and a contestation with the globalizing tendencies that are confronting us at all levels, whether you're working in a university or a hospital or a museum. These are challenges that are not unique to each one part, but go across the field.
In your lecture, talking about l'internationale, you talked about kind of core themes and some of the things you thought that having worked with this now for some time, and you've been working with them, and that's a really interesting relationship as well, because obviously that is yet another collaboration, effectively, and another platform, a different sort of platform. You talked about decolonizing imagination, that one of the kind of really interesting impacts of this kind of working in a confederation working this way was its ability to really begin to think about decolonizing imagination. And I wonder if you might pick that up a bit more.
Many of these institutions, their foundations are embedded in not just Eurocentric narratives of history, but have been developed around the modern ideal, which were effectively Euro-American. So the axis was no longer just, the sort of focal point was no longer us drawing from the rest, which was the classic colonial idea of the European being the pinnacle of civilization, and that all the other cultures being the raw material that fed into that processing machine. It then shifted in the post-war period in particular, whereby there was a sort of dialogue between, say, New York and Paris and Antwerp, or catching up in a sense, or Eindhoven wanting to be equal to a little MoMA or whatever. So the directors of each of these museums, in a sense, cut their teeth at the same time as those narratives were falling apart. They started to find their stride as curators, as independent curators, as directors of small museums, at a time when that narrative was collapsing, and there was an attempt to rethink the paradigm of what is contemporary art in a globalizing world. I think they all acknowledge not just the role of, say, third text, and Innova that you mentioned, but also the significance of certain events like ARCO, which brought to Europe the important trajectories that were being developed in the 60s and 70s and 80s in Latin America. Also the work of the Havana Biennale, and Eastern European perspectives, which had developed other networks of friendship and affinities and alliances, which were a counterpoint to the Euro-American axis, whereby in Ljubljana you see certain collectives like NSK forging links with Moscow, with Eastern Europe, etc., and producing alternative geographies. And so thereby you start to see not just an expansion of the field from which art is drawn, but a multipolar world. And that multipolar world, on the one hand, creates much more complex narratives, much more complex notion of how these constituent bits interact with each other. but it also enabled these curators and directors to rethink the way in which they work with the new migrant communities in their own cities. So decolonizing was, on the one hand, sort of like a meta narrative, a reworking of the big narratives, but it also pointed the direction of thought and engagement and perspective more critically to the local, because as we see at this point in time also, the demographic constitution of all big cities has been diversified to an extent that radically undermines any of the civic nationalist ideals of a homogenized public culture. And it produced new challenges around multicultural, intercultural, cosmopolitan visions of how the communities interact and develop new hybrid formations. So in a sense, this decolonizing the imagination was both breaking out of old Eurocentric paradigms and Euro-American models, opening up new multipolar visions of the globality, but also, I think, reworking with the local in a completely radically different way.
I mean, what you say is unbelievably resonant, of course, with both with what is currently going on, but also with a whole range of theoretical propositions, particularly, and I'm thinking of some of the things that you've raised right this moment about this idea of alternative geographies. And these are multidimensional geographies. They just won't allow for a hub and spoke model. Yeah. They don't allow for a single direction. So that horrible idea that there's a developmental model and something takes place in the West and then everybody else catches up in a kind of linear narrative. So they're much more matrix thinking. They're much more complicated, multidimensional, multilateral sort of ways of approaching the sort of geography. And what that undoes, of course, is the binary. It starts to really profoundly. But of course, we learn to think in many ways, in a kind of Eurocentric sense, in binaries, and we still have them lurking. And I kind of like to talk about some of the binaries that you raise and unravel, because I think your work is fantastic for being able to both see them really quite clearly, identify them, but then move beyond them. And there are two in particular that I think are interesting. One is one you raised quite specifically and went right back to kind of Greek thought for in your lecture with us, which is around place and motion, and this idea of bounded and fixed and solid, and the other idea of movement, and how those things have been played off, but they don't necessarily need to be. And the other one is cosmos and globe. And the cosmopolitan has had a bit of a bad rap, and I think neither of us would probably like to kind of maintain that bad rap. I think it's been reappropriated in a kind of neoliberal apologist kind of way for globalization, and yet it's very different. Thinking in a cosmopolitan sense and around the cosmos is not thinking the globe. So if you could possibly talk about those two sorts of binaries, that place and motion and that cosmos and globe, that would be fantastic.
I think that's important, and let's start with the more recent, the cosmopolitan versus, or in relation to, the global and the globalizing. Now, at some point in time in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was a moment of excitement. The internet was born. There was incredible opportunities to travel at much cheaper rates than ever before. New buddy systems were being developed in regions. The whole idea of networking seemed liberating. And the idea of cities also seemed like sanctuaries that sort of liberated us from some of the strictures of traditional national culture. Cities became sort of an exciting playground for experimentation and opportunities to sort of diverge from the sort of more conventional and traditional ways in which the nation was being defined. Now that's had all sorts of complications and negative consequences, which we'll put to the side, and we see how Brexit and Trump are a consequence of that division that I think we were also complicit with. But at the same time, as this utopian vision of how the world was going to move towards a more flowing and interacted and connected world, we saw that in fact the way in which it was being reorganized to facilitate, maximize and enhance connection was that it was being organized around principles of modularity. So the global presupposed the standardization of other economic, social, political, and cultural units. So the moment a unit is standardized, whether it's a piece of culture or a piece of or a commodity or a political ideal. It means it can be transferred and a commensurable unit can be exchanged for it. But that's where the analogy breaks down. Because culture in particular, and I suspect it's true for other parts of our life, is never equally transferable. It always produces a surplus or a lack. It always creates differentiation, even as you're seeking to achieve integration. So culture is not simply transferable in that sort of unitary, static fashion, but is something that is in a state of flow and is mutating and either expanding or contracting or reconfiguring, rather than just being picked up and being transferred elsewhere. So the principle of modularity, that is the cornerstone of this globalizing world, is in fact the antithesis of the principle of cosmopolitanism, which takes the dynamics of culture at its center. So I make the rather polemical point that the globe in globalization is not the same as the cosmos in cosmopolitanism, because in some sense, and Friedman says it himself, one of the advocates of globalization, is that that globe is a flat world because it has to be defined in a grid, unitary manner. The cosmos is a sphere. It's a forever transforming, dynamic, modular modality, not a modularity. And so that spherical way of thinking produces a real challenge to the way in which we understand the flows and connections, exchanges, equivalences, and differences. Now, once we posit the idea of flow, we then have to understand also its relationship to place, which you also put out before me as a sort of key part of the binary that we need to work with and unravel. And I've been stuck with this binary for decades. And so recently I sort of went back to ancient Greek philosophy in order to explore how some of these options were put before us. So we find in ancient Greek philosophy the idea that all flow is just an illusion, because what is permanent is stability. At the same time, we have the idea that everything is flow, everything is in a state of flux, everything is dynamic and interactive and atomic. And then we have these sort of Platonic and Aristotelian ideas that actually we can only grasp movement in relationship to an ideal form, or because of some primary resting place or ultimate destination. So if we accept that final position that Aristotle and Plato had put forward to us, then it prioritizes, it elevates the primacy and the naturalness of place as the framing of motion. You are pushed from one or pulled from one place to arrive in another place, and the natural thing is either the place of origin or the place of destination, and the motion in between at best is progress, but always is in some form a displacement. Now that instantly stigmatizes motion. Motion is not defined in its terms, it's defined in terms of how you have been displaced, misplaced in most cases. And motion, therefore, takes us to the experience of entropy, where we have dissolution and dissipation and loss of integrity. Whether you see that in a negative or a higher form, as some scientists are now saying, is actually entropy is not a loss of, but a gaining of complexity. So what we're seeing is a transformation in our vocabulary. But that may have happened in the sciences, but in the humanities and the creative discourses and in the social science, we're still hanging on to a very old vocabulary about place being primary. And so when it comes to thinking about culture, we see it through how it's related to a specific place. Taking culture out of its place is already seen as displacement of that culture, undoing its integrity, weakening its vital forces, cutting its, cutting it from its foundations, untethering it. Therefore, we see that it is as a sort of loss, as a dissipation, as a fragmentation. and that what we really need to do is somehow bring it back to its primary form and original condition. Whereas if we had taken that other trajectory of thought, which put motion as the fundamental part of life, then we wouldn't be talking about motion as a form of displacement or as a wound, as Epicurus called it, and as we've subsequently seen it being defined and characterized as. We'd see motion as the constitutive force of life and as the inevitable process for communication, which is what culture is about. Culture is a communication system. So, in a sense, I'm trying to reconfigure what John Arry called that sort of dynamic between mobility and mooring by rethinking the status of place and trying to sort of disentangle the idea of motion from the stigmatic associations and entangle the two in a different configuration of productive and constructive relations.
Yeah. And what you say there is, I think, really quite pivotal to the notion of unraveling the binary as well, which is that you don't simply substitute one term for the other.
Yes.
So you're not saying, well, that would be fantastic, let's do motion now. We forget place, that's not it any longer. And we still end up with a binary system because it's actually about the system of thought that you're thinking about. And the entanglement is actually really, really fascinating. And increasingly, one of the other terms you brought up in your lecture was sort of around transversals and the way people are thinking about transversals and how the Confederation is working through a sort of a transversal politics, a politics of the different sorts of breaking hierarchies, breaking simple linear forms and moving into this multidirectional sort of form. And in order to think that way, it is quite critical to start thinking very differently about a both and scenario rather than an either or. So the unraveling of these binaries is not about replacing one with another, but it's thinking entanglement for them. And there are two things about this. One is, first of all, that this, of course, suggests something very positive about migrations. And we are sitting in a moment when migration's on the agenda like crazy. Part of your invitation here was very much because you had been thinking through migrations and diaspora and culture for a long, long time. But it's come to the fore again now because of this notion of migratory crisis. Yet there might be a more positive way of doing this. Yeah. And one of the things that has been talked about over the last few days in a few of the events we've had is that it seems as though people who are interested in cultural change recognize that migration is relatively primary in our experience of culture and that we might be able to configure around it without imagining it to be crisis. Some of us are called hopeless utopians and cosmopolitans for that, but I'd really like to put to you the idea of some of the things that you've raised around the notion of a reconfigured commons in that, and this more positive sense of what it might mean to have this different group as the commons.
Yeah, there's a couple of big points in that presentation of ideas you've just outlined. The first one is to do with the breaking out of the binary system of thinking about migration itself. First of all, we used to think of migration as a single destination. That you left one place and arrived another. You left out of a place where there was lack and you went to a place where there's opportunity and hope and surplus. You left the periphery to go to the centre. And when you look back at all those mappings of migration stories from the 18th, 19th, 20th century, in some way or another, up to about the 1970s, you can more or less map it in those linear ways. The lines are pretty much pointing in kind of single destination. Not always, of course, we couldn't overgeneralize this, but the dominant trends were quite linear. But since the 1980s, any kind of mapping of migration explodes that hub and spoke model that you described. Whether you're talking about the migration of labourers, whether you're talking about the migrations of intellectuals or artists, it's become a much more polycentric and dispersed and iterative process. It's ongoing, it's dynamic, it's multi-directional, it's regional, it doesn't fit those old classic binary paradigms or linear mapping systems. So what do we do with this new complexity? And how do we understand the consequences of this mobility? on the one hand, it means that this sort of fascination and obsession that we have with borders needs to be rethought. I've come from Australia, and I'm not too proud about the fact that while Australia was a pioneer in the 70s in the settlement of migrants, it's now become a pioneer in the exclusion of refugees. The lessons that Australia had to offer the world in terms of how you can produce multicultural cultural policies and social integration schemes is something to be enormously proud about. But the lessons Australia is now giving the world in terms of how you can militarize border control is something I'm deeply ashamed of. And of course, Europe has got its own Frontex tools and technologies and techniques that have enhanced and expanded this sort of weaponized approach and surveyed approach towards migration policies, which is a huge topic of investigation in and of itself. But moving from this complex, fraught and jagged predicament that we're now in, we have to look at the example of what is actually happening on the ground. And we see a kind of mobility amongst artists and a capacity to form collectives, alliances and linkages that defy any of the earlier models as well. So the dialogues people are having, the partnerships that people are striking, the influences that people are drawing from are truly astounding, and they don't fit into the so-called national or even international mapping systems. And so while artists, of course, are embedded and connected and drawn from specific places, they're also in conversation with people and ideas from distant and unpredictable and sometimes very remote parts of the world. And the exchanges that they are forging and the way in which that is reconstituting their sense of belonging and their aspirations in the world is truly remarkable. And so how do we observe this? How do we engage with this? And I think L'Internazionale, as a sort of entity, at least provides a framework for this both transversal approach and this diverse iterative articulation in specific places. On the one hand, they will acknowledge and draw from that capacity for ideas to move across frontiers and to penetrate borders. But on the other hand, I'll see how this is developed and articulated in specific contexts. So while many projects have common headings and themes, the way in which they're developed in each of the cities is radically different. And I think that's a very interesting model that again provides a very powerful counterpoint to, say, the franchise model and the modular version of globalization, where you have a blockbuster and then you just sort of say, here, you can put it up as long as you have 4 walls, or et cetera, et cetera. Now I'm of course oversimplifying, but the extent to which blockbusters are given local inflections is a joke.
And what you say, I think, leads me to sort of the last sort of thing I really would like to try to unpick and discuss and whatever, which is something we've been raising a little bit while you've been here. We've been having conversations. It's key to my work. And one of the things that you were just saying about the relationship between the transversal, the ideas that can move across, but also having regional and local specificity and real nuance, and this abandoning neither of those things, being true to both of those things. And it raises a very profound question for transnational feminisms and coalition building and solidarities, notions of solidarity across differences. It raises a really profound sort of question that is probably very nicely articulated by Audre Lorde's comment, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And it leads us to thinking about tools, about methods, about how do we do this, about how do we keep up with the phenomena that are on the ground already, how do we articulate that, how do we theorize it, how do we think it. And we've had some conversations about that, but I'd really like to just open up a thoroughly speculative sort of thing. What do you think about tools, about how we're going to develop methods, where are we going to go, how might we begin?
Well, that's a spot-on phrase about the master's tools, not undoing the master's house. Right now, as you know, the term participation cuts across all aspects of governance, whether you're talking about citizenship involvement, whether you're talking about cultural engagement. Both the political and the social and the cultural are constantly being described as in a state of participation. Now, wow, okay, through the internet, through blogs, through SMS, the capacity for individuals to express and respond and disseminate their views and experiences has radically expanded. To what extent has that transformed political, cultural, and social institutions? I'm not sure. And to what extent have we as social scientists or humanists or artists have also developed tools to capture, to understand the significance of public participation? Again, I have my doubts. Of course, artists want to have their work experienced and perceived and registered in the maximum possible ways. But when an audience these days can engage with it at multiple levels and also engage with multiple other things through other platforms simultaneously, then we have to move beyond simply counting the number of people that attend an event and move beyond the idea that we can do a few surveys that are representative of those masses, and certainly move beyond the idea that this elite critic or viewer has the correct interpretation that others must follow. Now, I'm not discounting the importance of expertise, I'm not discounting the representative qualities of surveys, and I'm not unaware of the need of statistical information, especially for contemporary governance and audit and culture. However, what has not been captured is the complexity and the nuance of public participation. And so we are still to have a tool that can build and interpret and analyze the trajectories, the whirling masses of attention, the spin-offs in terms of sociality and connectivity that represent the diverse and dynamic ways in which people actually engage and produce new forms of sociality in the context of aesthetic engagement. Now, that is a great challenge before us. And so, on the one hand, we celebrate participation and then repeat the old-fashioned tools of observation and elite forms of interpretation. Between the three different domains, there's nothing that is actually joining them together at the moment. So I think that's an important activity to move towards, to find tools that can speak to that dynamic form of iteration and constitution of new forms of sociality in the context of public participation.
Mm-hmm. And I was going to, as you were speaking, one of the things that was coming to my mind was, of course, that one of the problems we have in approaching that is we have our own disciplinary boundaries. Yeah. We are sitting within our own place-made domains that are often very fixed and sometimes very difficult to break down and to look at. And so part of this also seems to reiterate something that you spoke of really eloquently in your keynote, which was about the necessity of collaboration now. Yeah. We really now need to start working together, and we need to think about ourselves having maybe a larger sort of set of inquiries. And do you have any thoughts about configuring those kinds of collaborations?
Collaborations in the context we're talking about automatically explode the idea of the unit. And the unit was often defined as subsets of the national. And as we know from Ulrich Beck's work, methodological nationalism dominated the sociological and cultural imagination. Now that we've explored and recognized and acknowledged either a globalizing or cosmopolitan world, that cosmopolitan methodology is not fully come in its place. And it's a tragedy that Ulrich left us perhaps a little bit too early. But it's a challenge for us now to step forward into this sort of development of a cosmopolitan and to move out of the idea of units and subsets of units and into a kind of field perspective. so that we're not just tracing how individuals have left one unit and gone into another, and assuming that that identification of those individual flight lines give us a sense of what has actually happened, but see how a field is constituted from a multitude of perspectives and positions and interactions. That field perspective is, of course, given when you're talking about the turbulence of water or atmospheres, but the turbulence of culture and the turbulence of sociality is yet to develop a field perspective. So I feel that this is one of the great challenges that's before us.
I think we're close to wrapping up, really, and I have to say that I think your invocation of the field and the fluid and the challenges that we have actually are a really wonderful place to end. It's speculative, it's open, it's all the things that I have admired in your work for so long and admired in your company. And with that, I'd really like to thank you for being here and for sharing all of that with us.
It's good to be amongst like-minded people.